Welcome to our monthly lecture in the series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. All our virtual programs are free of charge. Please help us keep it that way and join our summer campaign. You can find the link in the chat function in a bit. Your support makes our work possible. Thank you. Today, I'm honored to welcome Ann Fristoe Stewart, the director and curator of the Lieber Museum and Sculpture Garden in East Hampton, New York. She had the great honor of working side by side with Judith and Gerson Leiber until their deaths in 2018. She is dedicated to keeping their legacy alive through the continuation of their museum and through sharing their extraordinary works and the story of their fascinating lives with fans around the globe. Ann received a Master's of Fine Arts degree from Parsons School of Design in New York City, where she worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and for artists such as Jeff Koons, Rona Pondick, and Kara Walker. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Rachel, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's always a great pleasure for me to share the extraordinary lives and works of Judith and Gerson Lieber. This incredible story all began in 1921 when Judith was born in Budapest and Gerson was born in Brooklyn. Judith Lieber was born Judit Pető into a Hungarian Jewish family who was well-to-do, sophisticated, and cultured. Her parents were Emil and Helene Pető, and her beloved older sister was Eva. The Petős had just returned to Hungary after fleeing Béla Kun's communist revolution in 1919, seeking safety in Vienna. Judith's mother, Helene, grew up in Vienna, and her grandparents owned a very successful ladies' hat factory there. Judith was well-traveled and loved the arts and music. She adored visiting museums, attending the opera, and loved to swim, ski, and play tennis. Judith attended a top school in Budapest, where she was a very gifted student. In 1938, at the age of 17, Judith's parents sent her to London in order to study chemistry at King's College, because Jews were forbidden to attend university in Hungary at the time. It was their plan for her to follow in the footsteps of her great aunt and uncle, who owned a very successful cosmetics company in Romania. Judith would laugh and say, "I could have been Estée Lauder, but I'm Judith Lieber instead." In the summer of 1939, she came home from London for summer break, and on September 1st, World War II broke out, making it impossible for her to travel back to London. Because of Hitler and the anti-Semitic atmosphere and the new anti-Jewish laws that existed in Hungary, restricting the civil and human rights of Jews, Jews were prevented from working in certain professions, but were allowed a trade. Judith knew she needed to learn a trade in hopes that one day it would help her to get out of Hungary. Judith entered the Hungarian Handbag Makers Guild as the first female apprentice and began to learn the handbag trade. When Judith was growing up, her mother had many beautiful and fine handbags that her father bought for her during his business travels to the West. From a young age, Judith and her sister Eva would admire their mother's handbags. These handbags became the inspiration for Judith's decision to learn the handbag trade. In the Handbag Makers Guild, she worked for the top handbag company in Budapest called Pesel Handbags. She started as an apprentice, mixing glues, sweeping floors and running errands. And she quickly worked her way up the ranks from apprentice to journeyman and ultimately to master, learning how to create a fine handbag from start to finish. Judith was the first female master handbag designer. She said Hitler made her a handbag designer. As the war began to rage in Hungary, her father was taken off the streets and put into a labor camp and was forced to dig trenches against the Russian tanks. Judith and her sister Eva went to live in the Jewish community house for protection, and they sewed trousers for the soldiers. Their father was nearly starved and worked beyond exhaustion in this labor camp. A girlfriend of Judy's had an uncle who worked for the Swiss consulate, and through him, she was able to get a Swiss Schutzpass, a document that gave the bearer safe passage and thus freed her father from the labor camp and giving him diplomatic immunity. With this Swiss pass, Judy's father was allowed to come to a Swiss protected house to reunite with his family. A young boy in the house, Thomas Barot, who was a friend of the family, recognized the typeface on the Swiss pass and found a typewriter with that same typeface and added "and family" after Emil Pető, thus saving the entire family from certain death. Emil Pető's protection letter is on view at the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. In this Swiss house, there was relative security but little comfort, as there were 26 people living in a one-room apartment, sleeping on mattresses on the floor from wall to wall. They were not allowed to go outside except at certain times, and food was scarce. Judith said once the Nazis came to Hungary and occupied it, you couldn't work anymore. You couldn't do anything. We were lucky to be alive. As the war advanced, the Hungarian Nazis moved all Jews, even those who had protection, into the Jewish ghetto, the walled ghetto. Judy and her family were taken at gunpoint with the other families from the Swiss house to the walled ghetto as the war raged around them. The conditions were horrific and beyond one's worst imagination. As a means of protection, Judith designed handbags in her head to keep sane as the bombs exploded all around her. I tried to fall asleep by dreaming of making handbags, she said. In February of 1945, the Russians liberated Hungary, and Judy and her family were allowed to go back to their apartment. But because the windows were broken and the electric and heat were not working, Judy and her family lived in the basement with many other families until repairs were made, but they had survived. These two photos are just images of what Budapest looked like after the Russians liberated the Jews. Gerson Lieber was born in Brooklyn, New York. When he was very young, his family moved to Titusville, Pennsylvania. His parents were Orthodox, and he grew up in an extremely strict household, he says. He was a small-town boy, and even though he showed talent in art as a young student, his parents did not feel this was a means to a job and discouraged him from pursuing art. So he began as a typesetter for the Titusville Herald. At 19, he entered the United States Army as a Signal Corps sergeant. His service took him to Northern Africa, Italy, and the Mediterranean, and it was in the great museums and galleries of the cities he visited that his love for art was rekindled. His eyes were open to all kinds of possibilities. In early 1945, Gerson was sent to Budapest, Hungary with the American legation as part of the Allied forces, there to keep the peace and help the transitional government. On one of his very first days in Budapest, two young women approached him and his mates as they stood outside of the pension where they were staying. A friend of Judy's had a room in her family's home that they wanted to rent out to an American. Judy's friend did not speak English, but Judy spoke beautiful English, and so she went with her friend, as she would say, solely as a translator. This is when Judy met an American soldier who called himself Gus, and as the story goes, it was love at first sight. He asked her to the opera, which was one of her favorite things to do, and the rest is history. She was pretty, very pretty, Gerson said. She had great culture and a great love of music. Judith immediately knew she wanted to marry Gus. She said, in 1945, an American GI was something magical and heroic, and that was Gus. I was completely charmed, and I still am. They courted for a year, engaged, and then married in her parents' home in 1946. Knowing of Gus's deep love of art, Judy helped him enter the Hungarian Royal Academy of Art, where he set up a studio and immersed himself in art making when he was off duty from the army, and Judy designed and made fine handbags for the lady personnel of the American legation. Her handbags were beloved by the American ladies, and everything she made was purchased by them. Her green toolbox, filled with the tools of her trade, was her most valued possession. Gus was later given the choice of remaining in the army or being discharged, and the Liebers decided that it was time to head to America, where Judy could make handbags for a wider audience. So in 1947, they said goodbye to Judy's family and to Budapest, and they boarded a bride ship headed for New York. Judy had her treasured green toolbox in hand. They were delighted to be in New York. It was our promised land, Gerson said. Judith said, the memory of the Holocaust was burned into our consciousness, and we were relieved to be away from the land where it had occurred. Gus was inspired by his beloved New York City and made prints of her structures, buildings, bridges, rooftops, and power lines. While Gus attended the Art Students League and exhibited his artwork around the country, Judy worked for a number of handbag manufacturers, working her way up the ladder of success. Judy was a phenomenon. New York was emerging as the new fashion capital, and she was the only woman handbag designer in America. Her skills became highly sought after, and before long, she was hired by the finest ladies couture designer in America, Nettie Rosenstein. Soon, Judith was running the entire Nettie Rosenstein handbag factory and designing the finest handbags made in America at the time. In 1953, Nettie Rosenstein was commissioned to design Mamie Eisenhower's Inauguration Day dress and chose Judith Lieber to create the matching purse. The small pale pink clutch is delicately embroidered with pearls and rhinestones. This little handbag captured the imagination of women throughout America, and Judith Lieber became a household name. Nearly every First Lady, from Mamie Eisenhower to Laura Bush, has carried a Judith Lieber handbag on Inauguration Day. In 1956, the Liebers bought a country house in East Hampton Springs, and Gus says he was overcome by an all-encompassing desire to garden and would spend many hours gardening while Judith designed handbags. In 1963, Gus convinced Judy to strike out on her own. He told Judy, "You're not going to work for these schnooks anymore. You're going into business." Judy said, "I was scared to death, but I did it." The Liebers rented a tiny loft, 275 square feet to be exact, on Madison Avenue, right around the corner from 33rd Street, and with 4 employees, they began Judith Lieber Handbags Incorporated. Unlike many men of his time, Gus was willing, even delighted, to put his wife's career first. The very first line of bags they created actually failed. They were made in a grayish-green calf, which the customers did not like, and the timing was off, as the bags arrived in stores right after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. But Judy said, "Our minds were completely focused on achieving success. We were as focused on that as I had been on surviving the Nazi occupation. That experience taught me how to sharpen my focus and aim at specific goals." Judy said she made patterns every single day of her life while she was in business. When they traveled to Europe, they went to all the museums in all the cities, and she found inspiration everywhere. In those museums, in antique shops. She even found inspiration in their vegetable garden at their country home in Springs. Gus said she could see a handbag in everything. She was inspired by books and paintings, museums and music, even by James Bond movies. She was inspired by things she would see in yard sales, food dogs and Japanese lunchboxes, Turkish rugs and quilts. In 1992, she created a minaudière inspired by a Gus Lieber painting. She really could see a handbag in everything. Here she is with some of her bags in 1994. Here are some of her fruit slice minaudières, which she created in 1989. Here's her frog minaudière from 1978. Her egg minaudière, which was inspired by Fabergé in 1987. Here's her pink pig minaudière that was actually carried on the red carpet of the Oscars in 2014. Here's an assortment of her garden minaudières inspired by her garden in Springs. Here's her Buddha minaudière from 1979. Some fruit minaudières from 1986. And here there's a Chinese hand warmer and a Japanese lunchbox, which are some of her Asian-inspired creations from 1981. This is a decorated Indian elephant minaudière from 1988. Here's the swan minaudière from 1990, which was a character in the TV series Sex and the City. Horse minaudière from 1979. Here's a couple of her shell minaudières from 1979. Her teddy bear minaudière from 1989. Her asparagus from 1996. Her snake minaudière from 1989. So you can see she really did see a handbag in everything. This is her chatelaine. It was her first metal bag. The beading of the bags began not as much of an artistic endeavor, but as a matter of necessity. The plating on this first metal bag was so badly flawed that she realized some disguise was required. She decided that covering the bag with crystals would both hide and enhance, and thus her entire beaded handbag business was born. Her handbags were not merely utilitarian, but are beloved works of art that are adored and collected by many. Women are obsessed with them. Her bags captivate and inspire. They're in the collections of some of the greatest museums in the world: the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., just to name a few. The Liebers had a story that when they went to their beloved opera, they would count all the Lieber bags hanging on the shoulders of the ladies, and that it actually became easier after a while to count the bags that were not Liebers. Judith Lieber Handbags Incorporated was hugely successful, and they grew and grew. They went from that tiny loft with 4 employees to a 3-story factory in the shadows of the Empire State Building with over 200 employees. In his studio, Gus made paintings, etchings, and lithographs using the fashion world as his muse. The Liebers attended a great many runway shows, and he said the fashion world was a fertile field for his work. He was intrigued by the models, fans, critics, and voyeurs. Judith Lieber designed her last handbag, the Peacock Minaudière, in 2004. As the peacock personifies grace and dignity like royalty, one cannot miss the brilliance of this choice as her final design. It was in 2005 that Judith and Gerson opened the Lieber collection, a magnificent Renaissance structure inspired by the temples that dot the landscapes of the great gardens of Europe. We call it the Lieber Taj Mahal, as Gus built it with great love to honor the creative genius of his wife. It's a beautiful container symbolizing Gus and Judy's devotion to one another. Both Judith and Gerson Lieber passed away on April 28, 2018. Their legacy will live on in their extraordinary works of art and fashion and through the continuation of the Lieber Collection Museum and Gardens. Writer Mary Gregory says it perfectly when she writes, "In their early days, each of them saw pain and suffering. For the rest of their lives, Judith and Gerson Lieber defined their own realities by seeking, cultivating, and producing beauty through an enduring, inspiring love for each other and for life." Thank you very much. So we do want to open it up for Q&A. Here's Rachel.
This was fabulous, and we already have a few questions regarding the handbags, the production. Linda is asking whether she used any real gemstones in her bags.
So for the majority of them, she used the Swarovski crystals that you see here. But you did see some semi-precious stones in some. So she used Swarovski crystals and semi-precious stones. She did do a series of fine jewelry where she used precious stones. It was a collaboration with Harry Winston, and they did one handbag that was the white rose, and it was covered in real diamonds, and it is the most expensive handbag ever. It's listed, if you Google it, you'll see it's the world's most expensive handbag, and I believe about maybe 10 to 15 years ago, it was sold for almost $1 million. So, but that was her one, she really designed these bags to be something that the ladies could wear out at night and not have to go back to the bank and put them in the safety deposit box. So she designed these to be made out of brass and then gold or silver plated. And so it was really a a less expensive version of the fine handbags, jeweled handbags that are carried by royalty.
Mhm. Which leads to the next question, really, whether these bags are limited editions or mass produced, or what is the story there?
So they are mass produced. Judith Lieber would create the prototype, the first bag, and it would go into the showroom. She would release usually about 5 lines a year. So, and each would have maybe 25 new designs. And the buyers would come in and buy, and then they would go into production. So each design has however many were purchased for sale by the buyers. So they range from, she said, if there were less than 25, she would throw it out. It wasn't a success. But the most that she sold of one design was about 3,500. So they range in between 25 and 3,500 in terms of how many of each bag were created.
Mhm. And where were the bags sold?
So they were sold at department stores and boutiques all across America and in Europe. Um, Today, they're still being sold in India and all across Europe, China, um, but all of the top department stores in New York City and then boutiques all across America. A lot were sold in Las Vegas in the casinos, and then department stores across America. She did have a boutique in Manhattan and one in LA. And so those were the Judith Lieber stores. But they were carried by Saks Fifth Avenue, all of the big department stores.
Mhm. Yeah,
Harrods in London. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So we have two questions asking which was her most popular style and what was the most successful design for mass consumption.
So the one that I showed you, her first metal bag, that's the one that was the most popular. It sold the most bags throughout her history as the designer of the company. Um, it was also her favorite bag. She loved that. It was really the start of her beaded bag industry. So it was sort of the seed of everything that came after. She also absolutely loved the envelopes, and I showed you a couple, the ones that were inspired by Modrian and Brock. And the reason she loved those so much is that technically those are extremely difficult to create because you have different skins and each skin has a different thickness. So she designed a sort of skiving process that thins the edges of the skins and makes them uniform so that they could be sewn. And so it's very rare to see bags that are like that. And she really loved the fact that these bags were just technically really difficult. She never shied away from difficult difficult things or methods in her creations. And it actually excited her and made her um, want to go even further down that technical difficulty lane.
Um, so Baron is asking where her jeweled bags were made.
So they were always made in her factories in New York City. So she started out with that tiny little factory on Madison, right around the corner from 33rd Street. And always they were in the accessories district. So she would always say in the shadows of the Empire State Building, but they were right around 33rd, 34th Street in Manhattan. The metal part of the bags were fabricated in Italy. So what would happen was in her factory, she had an artist that had a desk in her office, and he would create the waxes for these metal bags. His name was Larry Kallenberg, and he talks about the fact um, that she was running an empire, and she would go, "Oh, I want the pig's mouth to be a little bit more upturned. I want it a little happier." Or I want, tip the head of the cat a little bit further to the left. And then she'd be back to, running her empire. But once that wax was to her specifications, the wax would be sent to Italy to a factory that it's called Casamonti's, and the company is still using them today. And Casamonti would take the waxes, they would make these big dies, these metal dies, some of these dies could be 25 different parts, and then the sheet metal, the brass was heated and put into these metal dies and pressed. So then when they were opened up, the dies were opened up, the shells were popped out. The Casamonti would clean the edges. They would dip them in the baths for either gold plating or silver plating. Then they would send them off to Manhattan to her factories. And once they came to the factory, the workers would clean up the edges again. They would put the pieces together. They would line them with this most beautiful gold kid or silver kid. And one thing that's a telltale sign of a Judith Lieber handbag is that the interior is impeccable, beautiful interiors. Then the process of applying all of these crystals would begin. And you have to imagine this is pre-computer, and you're now this could all be figured out on a computer, but she could see it in her head how you would apply the crystals, where they would go around a concave or convex surface, and that they would meet up perfectly on the other side. So each of these crystals are tiny, tiny, tiny bit different in size. And so then they are applied so that they meet on the other side. So she had 5 people that she trusted to take her original prototype that I talked about earlier, and they would paint a white gesso onto the metal, and they would paint the design onto that surface. And then these would head down to the beading part of the factory, and she had about 100 people that would apply the crystals to these surfaces. And it was sort of like paint by number, but crystal by color. And they would meticulously apply the crystals so that each one is slightly different because they're made by hand, but that they were true to the original prototype.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Are the crystals Swarovski crystal?
Yes. So she always worked with Swarovski. She had a great relationship with them. They even made colors that were only for Judith Lieber, like the tomato that I showed you earlier is a Judith Lieber red. And when she retired, they retired her colors. So you'll never see those colors of crystals out there anywhere else.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a commitment. What fabric was used in the interior of the bags? You said they look beautiful, smooth, perfect from the inside.
Yes, so she would always line her bags with either a gold or a silver kid skin, which is a very fine leather. And it's just so smooth. And, to like even to line this, if you think of trying to keep a fabric perfectly adhered to the edges, to the surface of the interior, it's quite a procedure, and they do a beautiful job so that when you open these up, you see a gorgeous interior. She always included a comb,
Mhm.
a little change purse, and a little mirror in all of her bags. Um, and then she also created pill boxes for each one of the metal bags has a pill box of the same design. So um, they didn't come with them, but you could buy them separately. And they're these beautiful little just gems, these little works of art, um, at a lower price point than the minaudiéres. So can collect those too.
So how long did the average bag take to make?
So she would say that one bag would take one worker a full week to apply the crystals.
Mhm.
But in terms of from start to finish, from concept to the showroom, it would take up to 2 years.
Oh, wow. Um, and Judith is asking, how did they actually attach this crystals?
Okay, so
Glued
it's a
on?
very, what's that?
Were they glued on, or what? What was the process?
Yes, they were glued on. And in that very first Minaudier, the first metal bag, she was trying to fix something that was a mistake. So she ran down to the accessories district, grabbed some jeweler's adhesive, and grabbed some Swarovski crystals and created that beautiful, beautiful handbag. But what she found was that that jeweler's adhesive was not strong enough. So, with her chemistry background, she created, formulated a water based adhesive that sticks like glue. They still use it in the company today. They call it their secret sauce, and it really sticks. And so, the way that these were applied is they were very low tech back then. And you know the wooden cuticle sticks that have a pointy end on one end and then a tapered end on the other? That's what they used. And on the pointy end, they would put a little dollop of beeswax, and they would have trays laid out on their working tables with colors of all of the crystals that they needed. And then they would dip the tapered end of this cuticle stick into the adhesive and make a little line, flip the tool over, and with the beeswax, pick up the crystals that they needed and apply them in the line. Then they'd flip the tool back over, get more adhesive, and that's the way that they um, continued creating the whole surface of crystals.
Uh, so somebody says, Aurelia says, typical price points are over $1,500. Is that was that the price back then also, or is that today's price?
So it's equivalent to today's price. So the crystal chatelaine that I showed you earlier, the first metal bag, it was designed in 1967. So the price then was less than $1,000. Um, I think it ranged around 700, but today it's over 1,500. So the company is still selling that frame, that shape, and the company has them listed for between say 5,000 up to $10,000 depending on the design. um, you can get a vintage Judith Lieber bag. Some of these that she designed, you can get them at vintage auction houses, and that's where you'll really get something for around 1,500. They do go up a lot from that, but I've seen them for, the minaudiéres from around 15 and up.
Mm-hmm.
The day bags are less. So you can find a vintage day bag for 200, 300 on up to thousands as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, that ties in. We have a group of questions about archives and about finding out information, and then another group of questions about her family. So I think we should go for. Somebody is asking, I have a snakeskin handbag. How can I find out the period period is what it was made in?
Okay, so unfortunately, all of her creations were made pre-computer. Um, so we don't have a catalog raisonné. We don't have, what the company has today. And what all companies have is photo documentation of everything they create. But we have in our collection about 2,500 handbags. She created over 3,500 bags. We have about 1,700 handbags, but then we also have jewelry and belts that she created. So typically, what I will tell people who come to these talks is that you can just shoot me an image of your handbag and I can give you as much information as I have. So our database is pretty good. It has dates, it has, her description of the piece, and sometimes I'll even have a note. She had the most incredible memory. So when we would acquire a handbag, she would say, "Oh, yes, that frame I got in Spain, or that decoration I created, inspired by, this Chinese butterfly that I had." They had a great collection of Chinese porcelains. And so she was inspired by her own collections at times. And those notes will be in there. So we don't have everything, but I love to see what people have. So you're welcome to shoot me an email with a photo. And my email address, so that you can take it down, is it's info, at liebercollection.org. And Lieber is Leiber. And then I'll get back to you with any info that we have.
Thank you. And you're talking about your database, and Tim wants to know whether there's an archive in the museum. What sorts of records were kept? That ties into that question.
So really, um, of the of the 35 handbags she designed, we have about half. So we don't have her full archive of everything she created, but the ones we have them um, in the museum. We typically, in each exhibition that we mount, each Memorial Day weekend, we mount a new exhibition that runs for a year, and typically there will be about 500 to a few more, maybe 550 of her handbags in the exhibition. The rest are in storage, and we have, museum lockers where everything is stored archivally and everything relates to the database. So everything we have information on in the archives, and then the ones that we don't have, I'm always looking. I'm constantly searching to see what we don't have and collect information on those as well. But we don't have a full archive of all of her creations, unfortunately. It is a goal of the museum. When the Liebers were alive, we spent so much time scouring the internet for, vintage bags that we did not have, and we would purchase weekly so that we could get closer to having one of each of her designs.
Mhm. So, okay, wow. So, so that archive, the database is growing basically as time passes.
Yes, that's
Uh,
very true.
okay. Who is the greatest collector in our times? Asks Aurelia.
So there is a mystery woman. She's Chinese. She supposedly is the largest Judith Lieber handbag designer. I mean, excuse me, collector in the world. She's referenced in the book Crazy Rich Asians in the opening. And the Judith Lieber company believes that they know who she is, but she's very secretive. So her identity is not known, but she has thousands of Judith Lieber handbags.
Wow.
And then we probably are the second largest collection, and it's Judith Lieber's own collection. But they are collected by people all across the world. There's just something special about these little beautiful sculptures.
Mhm.
They're not. Uh, they're not just for carrying a handbag. They carrying your items to a party or out at night. They really symbolize more for people, and they're handed down generation after generation.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
So actually, Joyce is asking how much you can actually put in the bags. It looks like it has only a very small space. And you said you talked about a comb, a pill box, and so is that all that fits in there? Or,
So, so the day bags, you can fit a lot more in, but these minaudiéres, Judith Lieber felt like if you're going out on the town, all you need to take with you is a tube of lipstick, your key to get back into your apartment or home, and $100 bill. And she felt like you should be feeling special and go out on the town and not be carrying a lot of baggage. She also would say, if you need to carry other things, that's what your escort is for. So she really wanted these to be special. And I my kids, I am very fortunate. I have two daughters who, with my husband, every Mother's Day gift me with a Judith Lieber minaudiere. And this I will. So, any of you that used to have a iPhone 6, the iPhone 6 fits in a lot of these bags. When they gifted me the Judith Lieber butterfly, I had the iPhone 6 and it would fit right in there. Now the iPhones have gotten bigger and they don't fit into these bags. But if, these were designed pre iPhones, pre cell phones, and so they were not considered. It wasn't considered a necessity to fit a phone, which now the company really pays attention to because everybody has to have their iPhone these days.
of course. So leads us to the correct question: who is creating these handbags today, and do they do they create new designs? Do they keep the original designs and keep producing them? But then you said like certain colors of crystals retired with Judith Lieber. Um, So what does the Judith Lieber company today, what are they allowed to do? And are those real Judith Lieber handbags that they're selling?
Yes, so all of the above. They create new designs, they reintroduce vintage designs. The colors are different, and also today, most of it's done by computers. So they look very different. Whereas, say Judith Lieber's tomato is very graphic. It's bold red with a green um, leaf and a gold top. And now they do a sort of shading of colors, so they'll have more colors, and they'll also create a little sculptural detail on top of the tomato. So you can definitely tell a difference, um, which tomato is created now and which are the vintage. But the company is now called Judith Lieber Couture, and it's owned by a branding company called Authentic Brands Group. Their chief creative officer is Jana Matheson, who is a great friend of the museum, and she knew the Liebers, and she would come out every year, multiple times a year, to visit. The first thing she would say always was, "Judy, will you design a new bag?" And Judy would also always say, "Nope, I am really retired, but be inspired." And so Jana would come in the archives and look at vintage designs. She really tries to design in the fashion of Judith Lieber. And then a partial owner of the company is Dee Aklepo Hilfiger, who's Tommy Hilfiger's wife. And Dee is also designing handbags. She adores Judith Lieber, and she had a handbag company of her own and decided she wanted to purchase a part of Judith Lieber Couture. So, and really what they are working on today is meeting the millennials. So, up to this point, I mean, now we have Gen Z closely behind them, but the millennials are the largest generation in the history, as you all know. And they are not big, purchasing objects. They like experiences, and it's just a different marketing platform to reach millennials. And so Dee is very good at creating images and handbags that the millennials are loving. So, we look at, again, I keep talking about the tomato, but you can talk about the asparagus or the eggplant minaudière, which were these just revolutionary images. A handbag that's a tomato, or an eggplant. And now these are some of Judith Lieber's most iconic bags. And so Judith Lieber Couture is creating similar food related images, but they'll have a hamburger or french fries or a hot dog or pizza, and those are really reaching the millennials. And then they also are inspired by artists in a similar way, to how Judith Lieber was inspired by artists. They just are inspired by more contemporary artists, so pop artists um, or contemporary artists that are making work out there today.
Mhm.
So yeah, they're still creating and still very successful, and working to create in Judith Lieber's sort of sophistication meets whimsy, and making these incredible handbags that kind of transcend a
Right.
typical handbag.
Right. So now we come to the last group of questions about her family. What happened to Judith's family? What happened to her sister Eva? Um, yeah.
So luckily, Judith, her sister, and her mother and father survived the Holocaust. They all ended up immigrating to America. Um, she had two uncles that were shot on the banks of the Danube, because they would not wear their yellow star. And many of her extended family were killed in Auschwitz. Um, she always said, even when people were talking about just the horrific reality of the Holocaust, she always made sure she said how lucky she and her sister Eva and her mother and father were to survive. As soon as any of them could leave Hungary, they did. Um, I talked about how Judith Lieber came to America, and it was very soon after the war. She came to America with Gus Lieber, but her sister ended up going to Jordan first and then to South America, and then was able to immigrate to America. Her parents went to Australia and then Israel, and then were able to immigrate to America. So for the for many, many years, the four of them lived in New York City and in the Hamptons, and um, up until the day Eva died, she spent um, almost every day with Judith and Gerson. She would come out on the Hampton Jitney from the city, um, and spend most of the week, most of the month really, in the Hamptons with Judy and Gus. And then she would go home on the Hampton Jitney all the way up till 97 years old. She was going back and forth on the Jitney. And she would go home and get her mail and do her banking and make sure everything was fine. Then she'd come back out to the city. So they were very, very, very lucky to all have survived.
Mm-hmm. So did Judith and Gus have children?
So they did not have children. There's a funny story. They both had their description of that or answer to that when someone would ask. And Gus would say very poetically, "Our children hang on the shoulders of the ladies and on the walls of the museums." And Judith would say, "The handbags are our children and they don't talk back." So you can get a glimpse into their psyches with their answers to that. But they made a choice to commit their lives to their art and their business, and were happily, no, without children.
Mm-hmm.
And Eva had no children either. So, um, but Gus had. There were seven children in his family, and so he has a very large family. Of most of his brothers and sisters have now passed as well, but he has, nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews that he was very close, that they were very close with.
Mm-hmm. And how was their Jewish identity? Did they get involved in Jewish causes? Like, did that play any role in their daily lives?
So they considered themselves culturally Jewish. Judy said that she was, um, her bat mitzvah was with 200 other girls in Budapest. They identified very strongly with the Jewish culture. they would celebrate the holidays, but they did not go to synagogue. Um, but and it was interesting when she got sick and started her end of life. Our cantor here, Deborah Stein, would come and sing to them, and it was so powerful for both Judy and Gus um, to just revisit um, their upbringings. So um, yeah.
Yeah, and did they get involved in Jewish causes?
So they did. They gave a lot of money to different Jewish causes. Very to one of the biggest recipients um, of their funds was Bar Ilan University in Israel. And they were huge supporters of Bar Ilan, and were also they gave to many Jewish charities, very many. So I know that they did also give to some fashion charities, but for the most part, they were Jewish charities. They did have a scholarship for a handbag designer at FIT in New York City. So for decades, they provided a education to a handbag designer um, at FIT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now the biggest, the last question and a big question also. Several people have noticed that they both died on the same day. And so their questions, how that happened, was Judith sick? Was there any tragedy that happened? So
Yeah. So when they passed away, she was 97, he was 96. And they were extraordinary. I mean, I would follow them around and I would be like, okay, what are you eating? What are you drinking? What music are you listening to? I want to be as strong as you are in my 90s. But in March of 2018, she started having those many strokes and losing strength in her legs. Um, but even in March, we were in New York City at a brunch in her honor at Sotheby's, and um, but when she came back, she started declining quickly after that, and just became weaker and weaker. And so they we did have hospice nurses at the house for her. Gus was still very, very strong. He always seemed sort of like 20 to 40 years younger than he was. He was very strong and very agile. Um, and so we were kind of making the plans for her leaving us, but we had no idea that he was going to be leaving us. But the Friday, they passed away on a Saturday, and the Friday before, he called and said that his heart hurt in the night and he needed to go to the hospital. And so I took him to the hospital. He did have, I think about 4 years earlier, he had been diagnosed with congestive heart disease. And so he did manage that very well with medicine. And that congestive heart disease, your heart doesn't hurt. So it really frightened him. So we went to the hospital and the doctors ran tests, and his blood pressure was very low, but he did not want to be away from Judy. She had not woken up for 4 days. and we knew that she was leaving us. So the doctors said, it's fine, go home to your wife. And we had nurses there, so they were taking his blood pressure, every hour. Um, and he ended up going to sleep around 11 o'clock. The nurses checked on him at midnight, and when they came back to check on him at 5 a.m., he had passed away. So he passed away before she did. Um, that night, when he came home from the hospital, he said to her, Judy, it's time to go. And he felt like she was hanging on for him, and he was giving her the opportunity or the knowledge that that he would be okay. Um, but like everything in their life, he was always right by her side and she by his. And I know nothing about what happens after death, but I just envision him going first and saying, "Come on, Judy, it's not that bad." And about 5 hours later, she breathed her last breath. So, the nurses were, when Gus passed away, the nurses were checking on her and said, her pulse is strong. She's not ready to go. Her heartbeat is strong. And then about 5 hours later, she breathed her last breath. So, we find some comfort in that they went together. Everyone talked about if one goes, the other is going to go of a broken heart. But I think that they just both went together. I do think Gus died of a broken heart of watching her decline. So, and this our wonderful cantor, Deborah Stein, made it possible for Gus and Judy to be buried in the same grave. They're in separate caskets, but they're in the same grave so that they're still together side by side. And it's very rare that that can happen. And Deborah made it happen. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Anne. That's very touching. I now encourage everyone who lives in the New York area to visit the Lieber collection in East Hampton. I'll send out the link to the museum's website in the follow-up email, and I'll also send Anne's email. So for those who have direct questions about specific pieces, they can direct them to her. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Anne, for this excellent, so very fascinating talk. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and be well. Goodbye.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.